Last week I finished reading The Naked Communist by Mr. W.C. Skousen. And, oh my gosh. A really fascinating, interesting book that I actually recommend that everyone reads. And, it was written almost 60 years ago, but is surprisingly relevant to today. And this whole week since I finished it, all I've been thinking about is like, oh, are we at war? Like, are we in World War III right now? And you might think, oh, that's absurd because, war's about blowing things up, about bombs and explosions and stuff like that. If there was a world war, surely, we'd be slaving away in factories making bombs and dropping them on everyone, and we'd have endless propaganda about destroying the evil enemy and they've got to blow them up. But as this book highlights, that era of what we call conventional warfare ended in 1945. Because in 1945, the Americans had developed nuclear weapons. And what that meant is that if two countries went to war in a conventional sense of armies and tanks and planes and bombs, then it would be very dangerous, because eventually, if whatever side felt that they were losing that direct conflict, would go to using nuclear weapons, and then the other side would retaliate, and they'd wipe each other out, but they could also wipe out everyone else on Earth with a nuclear fallout going around the world. And so it became ridiculously dangerous to actually pursue direct conflict. But the communists had a plan for world domination, and they weren't going to give up on this. And so the original plan had been that the Soviet Union would invade Europe, and then it would invade Asia, economically isolate America, and eventually invade and conquer America, and basically take over the whole world through direct military action. But when America got nuclear weapons, it didn't matter that the Soviet Union also had nuclear weapons. It was just, you could never do it in a direct conflict. So they focused most of their attention not on military hardware, but on psychological warfare. And that's where it becomes really interesting for me, because a lot of the things that I spend my time fighting against and trying to fix are actually problems that apparently communists have created. And they're deliberate problems that the communists have created because it's a way of destroying a country without the country realizing that they're at war. So I better use an example to try and highlight this. So in a conventional war, your country might bomb another country. And the purpose of that bombing is to either kill their men or to destroy their factories and their farms and their ability to keep functioning as a society. They may even just blow up whole cities to try and reduce the population of the enemy, or spread chemical or biological weapons just to kill them. Now, that can't work in the nuclear age, but what if you could, say, convince the women in the other country to have half as many children as they normally would? So instead, they used to have a family size of the total fertility rate used to be 4 children per childbearing woman, and now it's down to about 1.5 in most countries, and sometimes lower. If you can, say, tell women, oh, it's really bad for you to have kids for some reason, or that it's bad for the environment and you should feel ashamed because the world's overpopulated, and then those women decide to have less children, then even though you haven't fired a shot, haven't dropped a bomb, you have done more damage than all the bombs in the Second World War dropping the country could have done to that population. You have, like in a country like, if you did this to the United States, and they've got like 300 million people, if they just had half the number of children, then in a generation, you would have basically killed almost 300 million Americans by never having them born. And another one would be if you convince them to have abortions. Again, like there's something like 40 million abortions in the United States. Well, you could think of that as being bombing the country to kill 40 million people. It has the same effect. It's the same effect. So if you can't use conventional weapons to bomb a country, you can use psychological tools. This is propaganda manipulation to do just as much damage. And in the book, he goes through all the different 45 goals of communists, which American counter spies had captured from American communist spies, outlining their plan of what they wanted to do to America to undermine and destroy America so they could no longer be a threat to communism. And it contained some really surprising things. And I mentioned one in a previous video about coexistence versus resistance, and that once you adopt coexistence, you're halfway to surrender. It puts you on the defensive. And that the last thing they ever want you to do is actually have co-resistance. Like, so and just to recap that one, so how co-resistance works is that you convince your opponent that you are so crazy that if they threaten you, you're going to blow up the whole world with your nuclear weapons. And if your enemy believes that you would actually do that, then you're going to go, well, I better not push them. I better back down. I better hold myself back and not antagonize them, because otherwise they're going to kill everyone. And once you do that, you're on the defensive, and you can only retreat from there on. You can no longer push back, because pushing back is always associated with everyone dying. But if you flip it over, and if we convince the communists that, look, if we can't live in freedom, no one can live at all. We'll just blow up the whole world because we will not put up with communism. Then that puts the communists in the defensive situation of like, oh no, we better not mess with those democracies because they'll mess us up if we push them too hard. And then communism goes on the defensive and starts to decline and lose status. And that's all psychological. You can perceive that because the US was adopting a policy of coexistence towards the communists, that they were in the weaker position. They looked weaker because they kept backing down. And because they kept backing down, there was a lot of kind of instinctive support for the Soviets because they looked tougher. Like, oh, they really mean business. They're willing to blow up the whole world because of their cause. That means so much to them. And nobody necessarily thinks that, well, not consciously, but psychologically, there's kind of this perception. It's like, well, yeah, they've got the courage of their convictions, but do we really have the courage? But would we die for our freedom? And all too often, the answer is no. No. You can take China, you can take North Korea, you can take Vietnam. We're not going to push back. We're just going to cave in because we don't want everyone to die, and you're committed to your principles, and we're just not committed to ours at all. And that has quite an impact on your self-esteem, because you start going, well, what do we stand for? What do we mean? And that affects the mental health of the whole country. But to bring up another example here that really shocked me was that he talks about the use of pornography to destroy the fertility of enemy countries. And it's really fascinating stuff. So the idea would be that you promote pornography in the country that you're opposed to. And the communists did this with America, saying that, well, you can't suppress pornography, it's freedom of speech, and this is about weaponizing person's own principles against them. And the interesting thing about pornography is that it's addictive like a drug, and that if you can get people addicted to it, particularly the men, that causes problems in marriages. And these problems can lead to infidelity or things like erectile dysfunction, lack of libido, or a growing distrust between the couple because of pornography. And this leads to more divorces. And what divorces lead to is less children being born. And it also leads to a generation of girls who are very suspicious towards men, very wary of them, because they see men as being addicted to pornography, and they lose faith or confidence in men in that way because of that, because they look at men and they go, oh, that's really quite sad. And they also think, oh, that I'm not really valuable, that because there's a competition with the pornography. And, I hadn't really thought of that as being a weapon. I hadn't thought of that as being a deadly weapon of war. But let's just say you had the total fertility rate of 4, and just by normalizing pornography, you reduced that to 3. You have just struck a very smarting blow to your enemy. Because in a couple of generations, they'll just have less people, and you'll have more people than them if you can keep your fertility rate up. And you can overwhelm them with having more men, more equipment, more industry, more geniuses, and gain a technological economic edge over them through sheer people power. And yeah, using pornography as a weapon. And I'm just like, wow, that is such an interesting concept, that you could use something like that as a weapon in a war. And the other thing was like to destroy marriage, basically, to undermine any kind of like marriage oaths, that they weren't really important. You didn't really have to keep them, and so people kind of have this view of like, oh yeah, I can get out of a marriage, or like I get married, but it's not a big deal because I can always get out of it later. Again, that adds a lot of stress, because it's like, who would actually want to have kids, or a lot of kids? That's a big commitment with someone if they can leave at any time. So you create all these anxieties around marriage. You make it a very scary, unsafe institution. And that again reduces the number of fertility, because married women in a secure long-term marriage have twice as many kids as single mothers do, on average. And so these kind of attacks, you won't use them through, there won't be a front line. You'll be using things like the media and books and TV shows and movies. And here, the communists talk about taking over the newspapers, taking over the TV studios, the movies, and book reviews, book editors, and what books that they promote for people to read, so they can promote these ideas which are toxic to maintaining a happy, strong family, which will reduce the fertility of that country and make them vulnerable, or make them gradually weaker over generations. And the interesting thing is, you look at it on a mathematical point of view. This kind of psychological warfare using propaganda to undermine the confidence in people, it's far more deadlier than tanks and bombs. Like, I mean, short of nuclear weapons, you couldn't match the level of destruction that these techniques are capable of doing. And I find myself as a therapist going like, I feel like I'm having to constantly push back against really bad ideas that are harmful for my clients. Like, if someone comes to me and it's like, oh yeah, it's alright if I just have a fling while I'm married and I've got kids, and I'm kind of like, well, no, it's not. It's a really bad idea. But I'm like, who keeps spreading these bad ideas that I have to constantly push up against? And I'm kind of like reading this book going, well, what if this is what, maybe it's not the Soviet Union anymore, maybe it's China, I don't know. Maybe it's North Korea, maybe it's Iran, maybe they're pushing these ideas through our education system, through the and the media. They talk about the education system as well in the book. Get these bad ideas into people's heads, and they promote these bad ideas as if they're noble and good and just and moral. They call it social justice. And in the communist thing, again, that's why it's really strange. This book was written 60 years ago and it could have been written last week. And because people believe so passionately about these bad ideas, they follow the bad ideas off a cliff. And they don't realize they've been tricked into sabotaging themselves, sabotaging their lives and their families and their happiness, and they end up miserable, and they often kill themselves because suicide's going up to the roof. And a lot of it is because of these really bad ideas that communists are talking about promoting to kill as many capitalists as possible so that communism can take over those countries, or just they'll be so weak they can't be a threat to communism. And I'm like, wow, as a therapist, I'm kind of like a soldier on the front line of this war, that you can't really see. It's like, it's not obvious. It's all in the mind. If you can trick someone into doing something silly, like, the Kool-Aid example, if you can trick someone into thinking that suicide is a noble thing, and they go commit suicide, and then you can take all their stuff, well, that's a way of using a bad idea. I mean, you don't actually have to lift a finger to hurt them. They hurt themselves, but you kill them through bad ideas and convincing them to do something that's against their interest. And the question is, like, are people too trusting? Or it's not just too trusting. Are people not able to discern a good idea from a bad idea? How do you decide what is a good or a bad idea? And for a lot of people, it's what an authority figure like a TV show or a novel or a politician says, or it's what just the majority of their friends think, or what they think the majority of people believe, and that's the authority of deciding what's a good or a bad idea, not whether or not the idea has good merits in itself. And that's very worrying, because that's a huge proportion of the population. And they talk about dumbing kids down. So they dumb down the education system so people can't think logically. And if people can't think logically, they can't figure out a good or a bad idea. And they do just fall prey to, like, well, everyone else is doing it, or he said or she said I should do this, and they just do it because they take that as an authority, when the only authority is truth, and the way you find truth is mostly through evidence or through a very well-reasoned logical argument. And if you don't know how to evaluate all those things, then you are in a very dangerous situation where you could be you're in a war and you don't have any armor at all against the bullets, which are just ideas being shot at you all the time, bad ideas. But yeah, they've also got things, they talk a lot about art and culture and destroying things that are beautiful, and this is a fascinating thing because so they're talking about control art critics and directors of art museums. Our plan is to promote ugliness, repulsive, and meaningless art. Now, you might think, well, how is that war? How are you going to harm someone? But beauty is something that inspires people. If you believe that you come from a beautiful country with a beautiful culture, full of beautiful things, you'll want to fight to preserve that. You instinctively want to protect beauty. And it's like a lot of men can relate to this. They see a beautiful woman and they want to rescue that woman. They want to protect her, even from herself. And even at great risk to their own safety and well-being, they'll try to protect the beauty of that beautiful woman. And the same is kind of like with art. If you come from a society that has beautiful art, you go, I must be part of a beautiful country, a beautiful society, a beautiful nation. And by making art ugly, you have the opposite effect. You go, I come from an ugly nation with an ugly culture. It's disgusting. I don't really want to fight for it. I don't want to protect it. I want it to burn. And so the communists would deliberately make modern art rubbish, ugly, meaningless, that nobody cares about, just repulsive junk, so that people would go like, I'm not going to fight for my country. I'm not going to fight for freedom, because freedom's ugly and hideous. Again, it's like that's another way of fighting a war by other means. And the list of things goes on and on. And discredit the founding fathers, or the American founding fathers are talking about here. But, it's happening here because recently I've been talking about how Captain Cook is this really awful person, and he's the center of the foundation myth for Australia. And they've been saying that he was a really horrible person, and it's just not true. He was quite an extraordinary human being. And likewise, people like Thomas Jefferson were extraordinary people. And they kind of present them as being these selfish aristocrats who introduced these, well, in America's case, this whole new system of government that provided huge amounts of personal liberty, as being somehow self-serving and not actually an act of heroic love for their country. And when you convince people that the founders of your country are like racist, horrible people, again, you're going to go, well, why would I fight for my country? Why do I try to promote the values and ideals of my country if they're such bad people? It's like the art thing. And he goes on and on. It's really detailed. The communists apparently had very specific plans and goals of bad ideas that they wanted to promote. And they were fighting war. Like, it comes down here. Dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over those who oppose communist goals. And I'm like, is this the cancer that's destroying my industry? Have they been taken over by people who are using... Because I hear from people all the time. Like, the people come to me and they kind of like say, I've seen a therapist in the past. And I'll tell them about my a really abusive, violent ex-girlfriend or ex-wife. And they'll tell me it's all my fault, that I'm a misogynist and that I made her hit me. I made her abuse me. I made her verbally assault me. It was me provoking her. And I'm just like, wow, because that's crazy, because the whole, mental health is all about, a big part of mental health is about taking responsibility for yourself and not blaming others. And yet these are therapists who are literally saying that women have no self-control and they have no personal agency or accountability for themselves. And what they're doing, therefore, is encouraging women to be crazy. And that's not helping them. I mean, you play on their vanity, and that they like that. And the vanity is like pornography for women. So men get obsessed with pornography. They get addicted to pornography. But women get obsessed with vanity. They start going, oh, I'm so amazing. I'm so awesome. The whole world revolves around me. I'm so clever and brilliant and beautiful. And women get addicted to that vanity like men get addicted to porn. And just as porn damages men's ability to relate to women and to settle down and have a stable marriage, vanity has the same impact for women. It prevents them from actually having meaningful relationships with men and settling down and being the center of the family, which women generally are, because vain women are not concerned about the interests of their family or their children. They're only interested in about their appearance and how other people see them. And that's not at all helpful in any kind of relationship. That's, like the family, certainly not. And discredit the family as an institution, which is kind of related to another book I've read, which I will have to talk about more in the future, Family and Civilization, that the stronger the family structure, the smaller the government, and vice versa, that the more broken up the family, the more powerful the government is. And that's because in the past, families used to take care of their members. So if you lost your job, your family would take care of you. If you got cancer, your family would take care of you. But because the families have atomized, have stopped taking care of each other, the state is stepping in to fill that role. And so the state is taking care of people when they lose their job and taking care of them when they get sick. And what that leads to is the state growing so big it becomes involved in every aspect of a person's life and becomes a totalitarian state eventually. And so the only way you can protect yourself against having a totalitarian state is by having strong families that look after, support, and love each other. But here, the communists are like, well, we've got to discourage the family, we've got to break up the family, get that divorce rate up there, promote single motherhood. Doing these things will push people towards communism, because communism is about having a really powerful state that takes care of everyone. And the only way you can do that is by smashing the family. You cannot have loving, healthy, united families. And so the idea is to push in the media that these things don't exist, that there's no such thing as a happy marriage, there's no such thing as happy children, and there's no such thing as like loyal men or loyal women. Like, women will always cheat on you, they're always Marky Branch, and men will always have some prostitute or whore on the side. And through this kind of psychological manipulation, they can bring about communism, and people will welcome it. They'll think this is fantastic, and this is what they call subversion. So yeah, I mean, this is the question I'm going to push to you all. Like, what do you think? Are we at war? Are we at war in a psychological battle for survival? And what do you think about the idea that even though they're not firing a shot or dropping any bombs on us, they could be killing millions of us and we wouldn't even notice, because we can't see the people who weren't born because their families were destroyed by this communist propaganda? Yeah, it's a very heavy, very disturbing topic, and I'm sure I'm gonna. I love the book. It's had a big impact on me. I'm probably going to be talking about these things a bit more in the future, because as I said, I'm a therapist, and it looks like without realizing it, I'm a soldier in a war, in a world war, without even realizing it. Didn't realize I signed up for that. But yes, it definitely helps. It gives me a framework of looking at the problems in the world today in a very different way. So definitely we'll talk more about this in the future. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Apparently if I tell you that, it's like mind control, and you'll just do it now. So I'm very excited about that new power. And until next time, per spera ad astra.